No. No. I'll call you back. Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing general summary and conclusion from The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex by Charles Darwin. How we think about the future is conditioned by the ideas circulating in our present. The scientific theories, political ideologies, and artistic experiments we encounter expand and limit our sense of what's possible in the future. Though he was unquestionably a brilliant and very imaginative writer, the same was true for H.G. Wells. He imagined the future the way he did, at least in part because of the ideas he was familiar with in his era. We still agree with some of Wells's predictions about the future, and we disagree with others because we live over 100 years after he did. Science, politics, and art have changed. The future will seem at least somewhat different to us than it did to Wells. But similarly, 100 years from now, people will have a very different conception of the future than we do. We don't ever know what the future will really bring. But it might be helpful to us to consider how science, politics, and art in the past affected people's ideas about the future. It might give us a sense of how our own thinking has been shaped by the ideas and theories we are familiar with. I've assigned this excerpt from Darwin because I think it can shed light on H.G. Wells' thinking in The Time Machine. Darwin's theories were still controversial in the 1890s, but Wells was a self-proclaimed follower of Darwin. And I think it will be interesting to consider how Darwin's theories might have shaped Wells' portrayal of the future. Exactly how Darwin's work might have influenced Wells' novel is for us to think about and discuss together on Blackboard, and for you to perhaps write about further in your close reading and context essay. In this video, I just want to provide some context for this excerpt from Darwin and suggest some possible connections with Wells for you to explore. So, Charles Darwin, as I'm sure you all know, was one of the most important biologists in history. His most famous book was On the Origin of Species, which he published in 1859. The book was massively influential and, when it came out, also extremely controversial. It's now known as the book that gave us the theory of evolution, although Darwin didn't actually refer to his own theory as the theory of evolution until later in his career. His book, On the Origin of Species, basically set out two major ideas. The first was the tree of life. The tree of life is a metaphor Darwin developed to illustrate his theory that species change. Here it is, actually, as Darwin drew it out in his notebooks. According to Darwin, species change over time, with some species going extinct and other species splitting into different descendant species, much like the branches of a tree can die off and fall off or split into new and different branches. Some fish evolved into amphibians, some amphibians evolved into reptiles, some reptiles evolved into dinosaurs, all the dinosaurs died out or evolved into birds, and so on. This is a fundamental idea in biology now, one I'm sure you've already encountered in science classes, but it was controversial, even scandalous, when Darwin published the book. Previously, scientists had tended to believe that the various species had always existed in their present forms. There was also a theological element to that belief. The belief that God had created each species, having originally produced it in its perfect form. The tree of life challenged those assumptions. The other major idea in On the Origin of Species was natural selection, which explained the process of how species changed. The basic idea is that individual members of a species have some variations. They're a slightly different color, they can move slightly faster, they have slightly sharper vision, etc. Some variations give the individuals that possess them an advantage at surviving and reproducing in their particular environments. Their descendants inherit those variations, and over time, those variations become more common and pronounced, and the species changes. Again, this is now a fundamental idea in biology, but this idea too was really scandalous when it first came out. It suggested not only that species change, but that they changed for contingent, almost chaotic reasons. The world wasn't following a grand plan laid out by God. Certain variations helped certain individuals survive because they happened to live in certain environments. When Darwin published On the Origin of Species, he knew that his theory had major implications for the development of human beings. that his theory would suggest that human beings evolved from other animals, like apes. But he barely mentioned this in On the Origin of Species, because he knew the idea would offend and even horrify people. Only a single line in On the Origin of Species refers to human evolution. Toward the end of the book, Darwin wrote that following his theory, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. That's it. Nevertheless, smart readers drew conclusions about human evolution from the book, and there was controversy about it almost right away. The excerpt I've given you to read is from a book Darwin published 12 years later in 1871, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. In this book, Darwin finally directly applied his theory to human beings. The excerpt I've given you is from the book's conclusion, in which Darwin summarizes all of the book's main ideas, the most important being that man is descended from some less highly organized form. Human beings have evolved from more primitive animals, in particular from a hairy-tailed quadruped, probably arboreal in its habits. Now, how and why human beings have evolved into their present form has a lot of implications for how human beings will change in the future, because, as Darwin points out, the human species is still evolving. The principles that have influenced human evolution in the past are still in play and continuing to influence human evolution. As Darwin notes, man, like every other animal, has no doubt advanced to his present high condition through a struggle for existence consequent on his rapid multiplication. And if he is to advance still higher, it is to be feared that he must remain subject to a severe struggle. Otherwise, he would sink into indolence, and the more gifted men would not be more successful in the battle of life than the less gifted. I think you can already see how Darwin's writing seems to have influenced Wells. Here you basically have an explanation for the Eloi, the people who have avoided struggle and as a result lost their gifts and become indolent. I don't think Wells could have written The Time Machine if Darwin hadn't written his books. Darwin's theory seems to have been the basis for Wells' vision of the future. But one of the reasons The Time Machine is such a brilliant novel is that it is not only an illustration of Darwin's theories. We are, at any given moment in history, surrounded by numerous ideas and theories, and they all affect how we think about the future. As Wells wrote The Time Machine, he seems to have taken into consideration another theory about human development, an economic theory. For next class, we will look at how The Time Machine might have been influenced by this theory as well, the theoretical critique of capitalism by Karl Marx.